The muffled crying sound coming from the trunk of the 1955 Buick Roadmaster parked outside the abandoned warehouse on East 117th Street at exactly 2:37 a.m. on Tuesday, October 15, 1957, was barely audible over the sounds of nearby traffic and late-night activity in this industrial section of Harlem. But Bumpy Johnson heard it clearly during his routine inspection of the building his organization used for storing contraband and conducting interrogations. The soft whimpering triggering immediate alarm that caused him to signal Raymond, Quick Draw Carter, and Big Mark Washington to approach the vehicle cautiously, while he drew his .45 caliber pistol and positioned himself to cover them in case the crying was bait designed to lure unwary targets into ambush by whoever owned this car that shouldn't have been parked in location controlled by Johnson's organization without his knowledge or permission. The Buick's license plates identified it as registered to Thomas Red Brennan of Queens, New York, the same name that Johnson's intelligence network had been tracking for 3 months as leader of revived Knights of the White Camelia Clavern, operating in Brooklyn and Queens, recruiting white veterans and dock workers into white supremacist organization that had been conducting increasingly aggressive operations in black neighborhoods, including threatening letters, property vandalism, physical assaults on isolated individuals, and rumors of planning more serious attacks, including bombings of churches and businesses that would terrorize Harlem's residents into accepting renewed white supremacist authority over neighborhoods that had achieved unprecedented autonomy during the 1940s and 1950s as black population grew and black economic and political power expanded, despite persistent racism and discrimination throughout New York City's institutions. This documentary explores the moral complexities faced by criminal operators when they encountered child victims of crimes they hadn't committed and had no responsibility for addressing, creating situations where their decisions to intervene or ignore could save innocent lives while also exposing their organizations to risks from law enforcement attention, rival criminal groups, or political backlash depending on the identities of victims and perpetrators involved. While we present these events for historical understanding, we recognize that criminal organizations' involvement in rescuing kidnapping victims, regardless of humanitarian motivations, operated outside legal frameworks designed to protect children through established institutions and procedures, though we acknowledge the profound institutional failures that created situations where criminals sometimes provided protections and interventions that police and social services either couldn't deliver or wouldn't prioritize adequately. Age-restricted for mature audiences studying organized crime history, child welfare systems, racial terrorism in mid-century America, and the complex moral landscapes where right and wrong, legal and illegal, humanitarian and self-interested intersected in ways that defy simple categorization. Big Mark Washington approached the Buick's trunk carefully while Raymond Carter positioned himself to watch for potential threats from surrounding buildings and alleys where attackers might be waiting to spring trap. And when Big Mark used tools from his jacket pocket to pick the trunk lock and lift the lid slowly enough to assess what was inside before committing to full opening, what he discovered was a 6-year-old boy with sandy blonde hair, blue eyes, rope binding his hands and feet, duct tape covering his mouth, wearing pajamas suggesting he had been taken from his bed, and showing signs of approximately 12 hours captivity based on the dehydration and disorientation evident in his wide, terrified eyes that locked onto Big Mark's face, with expression combining desperate hope for rescue and paralyzing fear that this black man opening the trunk might be another threat rather than savior from nightmare that had consumed him since being grabbed from his bedroom sometime Monday evening. Bumpy Johnson's immediate assessment of the situation involved several rapid calculations about who this child was, why Thomas Brennan had kidnapped him and left him in trunk outside Johnson's warehouse, whether this was intentional attempt to frame Johnson for kidnapping or simply unfortunate coincidence that Brennan had chosen this location to park temporarily while conducting other business, what risks Johnson would face if he reported the kidnapping to police versus if he attempted to return the child independently, and most fundamentally, whether Johnson could morally justify ignoring this terrified child to protect his own interests when he possessed information and capabilities that could save the boy's life and return him to his family, who must be experiencing unimaginable anguish during the hours since their son had been taken. The decision to bring the child inside the warehouse rather than leaving him in the trunk or immediately calling police reflected Johnson's recognition that understanding the full situation required time and investigation that couldn't be conducted on the street, where their activity with the Buick might attract attention from passing patrol cars or witnesses who might complicate matters. Before Johnson determined optimal approach to handling this unexpected crisis. Big Mark carried the boy inside gently despite the child's terrified resistance, brought him to office area where Johnson conducted business, removed the duct tape carefully to avoid causing additional pain, offered water which the boy gulped desperately, and began the delicate process of gathering information from traumatized child about his identity, what had happened to him, and whether he had any information about his captors that might help Johnson decide how to proceed. The child's name was Christopher Michael Reynolds. He lived with his parents in an exclusive neighborhood in Riverdale section of the Bronx. He had been sleeping in his bed Monday night when two masked men entered his room around 9:30 p.m. and grabbed him despite his screaming that had awakened his parents but hadn't prevented the kidnappers from escaping through window with the boy before his father could reach the bedroom, and during the approximately 17 hours since his abduction, he had been held in basement of building he couldn't identify before being moved to the trunk of the car where Bumpy's people had found him. The details Christopher provided were fragmented and confused, as would be expected from traumatized 6-year-old, but Johnson's experienced questioning extracted enough information to begin constructing understanding of what had occurred and why. The critical detail that transformed this from tragic kidnapping of random child into explosive political crisis with enormous implications for Johnson's organization came when Christopher mentioned his father's name and occupation, Federal Judge Michael Reynolds, recently appointed to Southern District of New York and currently presiding over multiple high-profile cases, including federal prosecution of Thomas "Red" Brennan and 17 other members of Knights of the White Camelia on charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights through pattern of racially motivated violence and intimidation, targeting black citizens in violation of recently strengthened federal civil rights statutes that made such activities federal crimes punishable by substantial prison sentences. The kidnapping was clearly intended either to pressure Judge Reynolds into dismissing charges or showing leniency during sentencing, or alternatively to intimidate him and other judges from pursuing aggressive enforcement of civil rights laws against white supremacist organizations whose terrorism federal government was finally beginning to take seriously after decades of tolerating or ignoring such violence. If you've encountered situation where moral obligation to help innocent person conflicts with self-interest and strategic calculations, subscribe and comment about times when right choice wasn't clear or easy, because what happened next would force Bumpy Johnson to make decision with no good options. Turning Christopher over to police would expose Johnson's organization to intensive investigation into why KKK leader's car with kidnapped judge's son was found at warehouse Johnson controlled, but failing to return, Christopher would leave child in danger while potentially making Johnson complicit in kidnapping plot he had no involvement with and would never have participated in, given both his moral opposition to harming children and his strategic understanding that attacking federal judge's family invited level of law enforcement response that would be catastrophic for criminal organizations. The intelligence gathering that Johnson's organization had been conducting on Thomas Brennan and Knights of the White Camelia provided crucial context for understanding how this kidnapping fit into broader pattern of KKK terrorism and how returning Christopher safely might create opportunities for Johnson to simultaneously serve humanitarian purpose and advance his strategic interests in destroying white supremacist organization that threatened both Harlem's black community and Johnson's own operations. The information Johnson's network had compiled included details about Brennan's leadership role planning various attacks, his connections to corrupt police officers who provided protection and intelligence, his sources of funding from white business owners sympathetic to white supremacist agenda, and his organization's internal tensions between members advocating violent terrorism and those preferring legal political organizing to advance racist goals. The decision Johnson made at 3:47 a.m. Tuesday morning reflected both his moral commitment to protecting innocent children regardless of their race and his strategic calculation that orchestrating Christopher's safe return while exposing Brennan's role in the kidnapping would serve multiple purposes, including demonstrating Johnson's humanitarian values that countered racist stereotypes about black criminals, undermining Knights of the White Camelia through federal prosecution that would intensify if kidnapping charges were added to existing civil rights violations, and potentially earning goodwill from federal law enforcement officials who might become less aggressive toward Johnson's organization if they recognized his role in saving federal judge's son and helping secure additional evidence against KKK terrorists. The plan Johnson developed over next 90 minutes involved keeping Christopher safe and comfortable in the warehouse office, while Johnson's intelligence team investigated where Thomas Brennan and his co-conspirators were currently located, whether they knew Johnson had discovered Christopher in their car trunk, what their plans had been for contacting Judge Reynolds with ransom demands or other instructions, and how Johnson could return Christopher to his parents through methods that protected the child's safety while also positioning Johnson favorably with both law enforcement and Harlem community who would learn that their most powerful criminal operator had saved white child from KKK kidnapping despite having no obligation to do so and despite risks involved in inserting himself into federal investigation. Raymond Carter's surveillance operations located Thomas Brennan at 4:23 a.m. at apartment in Astoria, Queens, where Knights of the White Camelia held meetings and where Brennan apparently believed his car and its valuable cargo remained safely parked outside the Harlem warehouse until he completed planning with 4 accomplices for how to communicate with Judge Reynolds about ransom payment and case dismissal they intended to demand in exchange for Christopher's safe return. The surveillance revealed that Brennan and his accomplices were scheduled to return to the warehouse at 6:02 a.m. to retrieve Christopher for next phase of their kidnapping operation, creating time pressure for Johnson to complete his own intervention before kidnappers discovered that their victim had been found and that Johnson now controlled the situation. The coordination between Johnson's organization and FBI field office in Manhattan involved delicate negotiations conducted through intermediary contacts who could facilitate communication without requiring Johnson to directly contact federal agents in ways that might create records compromising his organization. The message Johnson sent through these channels informed FBI that he had information about kidnapping of Christopher Reynolds, including location where kidnappers planned to meet at 6 a.m., and that he could arrange safe recovery of the child if FBI agreed to certain conditions, including no investigation of how Johnson obtained this information, no publicity about his role in the rescue that might make him target for retaliation by KKK members, and consideration of reduced scrutiny toward Johnson's organization as implicit recognition of his cooperation in matter of vital federal interest. The FBI's response reflected both their desperation to rescue Christopher after 18 hours of frantic searching that had produced no leads about his whereabouts or his captors' identities, and their pragmatic recognition that Johnson's criminal connections sometimes provided intelligence and capabilities that federal agents couldn't access through legitimate investigative methods. Special Agent Patrick Donnelly, who led the kidnapping investigation, agreed to Johnson's conditions with understanding that this cooperation created no formal immunity or protection for Johnson's illegal activities, but did represent informal acknowledgement that Johnson had provided valuable service to federal government in crisis situation that would be remembered favorably when making decisions about resource allocation and enforcement priorities in Harlem. Have you seen situations where criminals and law enforcement cooperated on specific matters despite general antagonism and opposing interests? Hit like and subscribe, because the rescue operation that unfolded over next 2 hours would demonstrate sophisticated criminal organizations' capabilities, while also revealing complex relationships between black criminal operators, white supremacist terrorists, federal law enforcement, and innocent victims whose safety sometimes depended on alliances and cooperation that transcended legal categories and moral simplifications about good guys and bad guys. The tactical plan for rescuing Christopher and apprehending Thomas Brennan required careful choreography between Johnson's people who would maintain surveillance and provide intelligence, FBI agents who would conduct actual arrests to avoid legal complications from civilians capturing suspects, and coordination to ensure Christopher's safety throughout operation, including contingency plans if kidnappers detected FBI presence and attempted to flee or harm their hostage. Johnson positioned 6 of his most trusted operatives around the warehouse and surrounding blocks to monitor approach routes and signal when Brennan and accomplices were arriving, while FBI deployed 12 agents in unmarked vehicles positioned to move quickly once suspects were identified and confirmed to be at location. Christopher Reynolds remained in warehouse office under care of Bumpy Johnson, who Bumpy had called at 4:15 a.m. to come provide maternal presence and reassurance for traumatized child who needed comfort and stability during terrifying ordeal. Mamie arrived 23 minutes later bringing food, clean clothes that approximated Christopher's size, and most importantly, the calm, dignified warmth that characterized her interactions with everyone, including this frightened white child who had been taught by his Bronx private school education and his parents' liberal values that black people deserved respect and equality, but who had never actually spent significant time with black adults, and who found Mamie's kindness and Big Mark's gentle protectiveness confusing given what his limited 6-year-old understanding had led him to expect based on negative stereotypes that persisted even in supposedly progressive families and institutions. The transformation in Christopher's demeanor during the approximately 90 minutes he spent with Mamie before FBI agents retrieved him illustrated how direct personal experience could begin undermining racist assumptions even in young children who had been exposed to such prejudices indirectly through cultural messages and structural segregation that kept white and black communities largely separated, despite official integration policies. Christopher initially maintained wary distance from Mamie despite his desperate need for comfort. But her patient gentleness and sincere concern for his well-being gradually broke through his resistance until he was sitting on her lap eating sandwich she had prepared while she told him stories about Harlem and assured him that he would be returned to his parents safely very soon and that the people caring for him would make sure nothing bad happened to him before reunion with his family. Thomas Brennan and his 4 accomplices arrived at the warehouse at 5:58 a.m., driving 2 cars and parking near the Buick where they expected to find Christopher still secured in the trunk, their casual confidence and lack of security precautions suggesting they had no suspicion that their operation had been discovered or that overwhelming federal and criminal force was positioned to capture them within seconds of their exiting their vehicles. The arrests executed by FBI agents at 6:02 a.m. were tactically flawless with Brennan and accomplices surrounded and disarmed before they could reach weapons they carried or attempt to flee scene, and within 11 minutes all 5 suspects were in custody while FBI agents were reading them their rights and beginning process of transporting them to federal detention facility for interrogation about kidnapping charges that would be added to existing civil rights violations they already faced. Special Agent Donnelly's brief meeting with Bumpy Johnson at 6:19 a.m. acknowledged the unusual nature of their cooperation while also establishing clear boundaries about future interactions and expectations. Donnelly thanked Johnson for information that had enabled safe recovery of Christopher and capture of his kidnappers, confirmed that FBI would honor agreement not to investigate Johnson's role or publicize his cooperation, and stated directly that this cooperation created no ongoing relationship or immunity from prosecution if Johnson's organization engaged in activities requiring federal response. Johnson accepted these terms while also making clear that he viewed federal aggressive enforcement of civil rights laws against KKK terrorists as serving interests of Harlem's black community that Johnson both exploited and protected, and that future cooperation on specific matters might be possible if circumstances created mutual interests without compromising either party's fundamental positions and obligations. Christopher Reynolds' reunion with his parents occurred at FBI field office at 7:34 a.m. after doctors had examined him and confirmed he was physically unharmed, though obviously psychologically traumatized by his ordeal. and after FBI agents had debriefed him gently about his experiences to gather evidence for prosecution of his kidnappers. The emotional reunion was witnessed by several FBI agents, who later reported that Christopher's first words after embracing his parents included statement that, "Nice black lady and her friends saved me and took care of me until you could come get me," creating moment that confounded racist assumptions about black criminals as universally threatening and violent people deserving harsh law enforcement, rather than nuanced understanding that recognized how economic and racial oppression created criminal activity, while also acknowledging that criminals remained human beings capable of moral choices, including protecting innocent children regardless of those children's race. Judge Michael Reynolds' private meeting with Bumpy Johnson 3 days later at neutral location arranged through intermediaries reflected the judge's desire to thank personally the man whose organization had saved his son, while also establishing clear understanding that gratitude for specific humanitarian action didn't create any improper relationship or influence regarding judicial duties, including presiding over Brennan trial, where kidnapping charges had now been added to civil rights violations. The conversation between these two powerful men from vastly different worlds revealed both their differences and surprising commonalities, including shared commitment to protecting children, recognition that systemic racism created conditions where black communities developed parallel power structures, including criminal organizations, because legitimate institutions failed to serve them equitably, and mutual respect between intelligent strategic thinkers who understood complexity and moral ambiguity better than people who viewed world through simplistic categories of legal versus illegal, good versus evil, legitimate versus criminal. Judge Reynolds explained that he had opposed racism throughout his legal career, including work as civil rights attorney before appointment to federal bench, that he recognized systemic failures forcing black communities to rely on figures like Johnson for protection and resources that should have been provided through legitimate channels, and that Christopher's rescue had given him direct evidence that stereotypes about black criminals were inadequate for understanding complex realities of how people responded to unjust systems by creating alternative structures that served both exploitative and protective functions, depending on perspective and context. Johnson acknowledged that his criminal activities harmed Harlem's community in various ways, including gambling operations extracting wealth from poor residents who could least afford losses, but that his organization also provided protection from white supremacist violence that police either couldn't prevent or wouldn't prioritize, and that the choice he had made to save Christopher rather than ignore his suffering reflected genuine moral commitment that coexisted with criminal enterprise, just as legitimate businesses often engaged in exploitation while claiming to serve public good. The broader implications of Christopher's kidnapping and rescue extended far beyond immediate crisis to reshape several important relationships and perceptions, including federal law enforcement's recognition that cooperation with powerful black criminal operators might sometimes serve justice goals that couldn't be achieved through conventional investigative methods, Harlem community's understanding that Johnson's protection extended even to white children of federal judges rather than being limited to narrow self-interest, and white New Yorkers' confrontation with uncomfortable reality that black criminal had protected white child from white supremacist terrorists whose racism made them greater threat to civilization than Johnson's illegal gambling and other vice operations that harmed individuals but didn't threaten democratic institutions or fundamental human rights the way KKK terrorism did. The prosecution of Thomas Brennan and his 4 accomplices for kidnapping and civil rights violations resulted in convictions on all counts, with Brennan receiving 40-year federal prison sentence that ensured he would spend rest of his productive life incarcerated, while his accomplices received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, depending on their specific roles in kidnapping and other KKK activities. The trials provided extensive publicity about Knights of the White Camelia's terrorist operations, including evidence of broader conspiracy involving corrupt police officers who had provided intelligence and protection, white business owners who had funded operations and recruitment networks extending throughout Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of New Jersey. The convictions effectively destroyed organized KKK presence in New York metropolitan area for remainder of 1950s and most of 1960s, not eliminating racist attitudes among white residents but substantially reducing organized white supremacist terrorism that had been escalating during mid-1950s as civil rights movement gained momentum and challenged racial hierarchies that had governed American society since founding. The media coverage of Christopher's kidnapping included heavily sanitized accounts that credited FBI investigation for rescue without mentioning Johnson's crucial role in discovering the child and facilitating his safe recovery, reflecting both FBI's agreement to protect Johnson's anonymity and broader journalistic patterns of excluding Black perspectives and contributions from narratives about major news events, even when Black people had played central roles. However, within Harlem and among New York's Black communities, the full story circulated through oral networks and community institutions including churches, barbershops, social clubs, and family gatherings, where people discussed how Bumpy Johnson had saved white judge's son, despite having no obligation to do so, and despite risks involved, creating legend that reinforced Johnson's reputation as protector who defended not just his own interests but broader principles of human decency that transcended racial boundaries even while recognizing how racism shaped everything in American society. The institutional failures that had created situation where federal judge's child needed rescue by criminal organization included inadequate police protection for families of judges presiding over controversial cases, insufficient intelligence gathering about KKK terrorist plans that might have prevented kidnapping, and broader patterns of law enforcement neglect regarding white supremacist violence that had allowed organizations like Knights of the White Camelia to operate with relative impunity until federal government finally began taking such terrorism seriously during late 1950s, partly in response to international embarrassment during Cold War competition with Soviet Union. Christopher's kidnapping demonstrated that even wealthy white families connected to powerful institutions weren't fully protected from racist terrorism, though they obviously received far more attention and resources during crisis than Black families experienced when their children were threatened or harmed by white supremacist violence that police often ignored or minimized. The complex moral questions raised by Johnson's rescue of Christopher included whether celebrating criminals' humanitarian action inadvertently legitimized his harmful activities, whether acknowledging cooperation between criminals and law enforcement undermined respect for legal institutions and boundaries, whether focusing on exceptional case of Black criminal saving white child reinforced stereotypes about Black criminality requiring white victims for intervention to be considered newsworthy, and whether crediting Johnson for moral choice distracted from addressing systemic racism and economic oppression that created conditions where criminal organizations provided services and protections that legitimate institutions should have delivered. These questions didn't have simple answers but rather required sustained examination of how systemic injustice created morally complicated situations where right and wrong, legal and illegal, humanitarian and self-interested intersected in ways that challenged simplistic moral categories. If you've learned about complex intersections of racism, criminal power, child welfare, and moral choice, hit subscribe for more stories exploring how historical figures navigated impossible situations where institutional failures created dependencies on imperfect and morally compromised actors. Tell us in comments whether you think Johnson deserves credit for saving Christopher or whether celebrating this action obscures broader harms his criminal organization perpetrated against Harlem's community. Christopher Reynolds' long-term psychological recovery from kidnapping required years of therapy addressing both trauma from abduction and captivity, and complicated feelings about Black people stemming from experience of being saved by Black criminals after being terrorized by white supremacists who had claimed their racism was necessary to protect white children from imagined Black threats. His parents enrolled him in integrated school where he developed genuine friendships with Black classmates and where his direct knowledge that Black adults had protected him when he was most vulnerable helped counteract racist messages that pervaded American culture during 1950s and 1960s. Christopher later credited his kidnapping and rescue with shaping his worldview, including recognition that moral character correlated with individual choices rather than racial categories, and that systemic racism created perverse situations where criminals sometimes acted more humanely than respectable citizens whose conventional morality coexisted with support for unjust systems. Judge Reynolds's judicial career continued through 1973 retirement with reputation for vigorous enforcement of civil rights laws and willingness to impose substantial sentences on defendants convicted of racially motivated violence, earning him both respect from civil rights advocates and hatred from white supremacists who viewed him as traitor to his race for prioritizing equal justice over racial solidarity. His relationship with Johnson never extended beyond their single private meeting and occasional indirect communication through mutual contacts, but Reynolds consistently opposed prosecution of Johnson's organization for vice crimes that Reynolds viewed as lower priority than violent crimes and civil rights violations requiring federal attention, creating informal protection that Johnson appreciated while understanding it created no formal immunity and could be withdrawn if circumstances changed or if Johnson's activities crossed lines that Reynolds considered intolerable. Bumpy Johnson's reputation throughout Harlem was enhanced by story of Christopher's rescue becoming part of community folklore, illustrating both Johnson's power and his moral commitment to protecting children regardless of race. The narrative that circulated emphasized Johnson's decision to help white child despite having no connection to Reynolds' family and despite risks from involving himself in federal investigation, demonstrating that Johnson's values extended beyond narrow self-interest to encompass genuine humanitarian concern that transcended racial boundaries while also recognizing how racism shaped American society and created situations where black criminal organizations provided protections that legitimate institutions refused to guarantee. This reputation served Johnson's interests by building loyalty and support within Harlem, while also complicating efforts by police and prosecutors to portray him as purely predatory criminal, deserving maximum punishment rather than complex figure whose activities included both harmful exploitation and genuine community service. The Knights of the White Camelia's destruction through federal prosecution following Christopher's kidnapping represented significant victory for civil rights enforcement and demonstrated federal government's increasing willingness during late 1950s to use its powers against white supremacist terrorism that state and local authorities often ignored or tacitly endorsed. The prosecutions sent message throughout white supremacist networks that attacking federal officials or their families would trigger overwhelming law enforcement response that could destroy entire organizations, and that federal civil rights laws provided mechanisms for punishing racist violence that had previously operated with impunity when victims were black citizens whose complaints didn't receive serious attention from police and prosecutors. However, the victory was partial and temporary as new white supremacist organizations would emerge throughout 1960s to resist civil rights movement through terrorism that continued despite federal prosecutions, demonstrating that legal victories alone couldn't eliminate deeply rooted racism, requiring sustained cultural and structural transformation. The relationship between Johnson's organization and FBI following Christopher's rescue never developed into formal cooperation or ongoing alliance, but did create mutual understanding that specific situations might warrant coordination when interests temporarily aligned, and that such cooperation could occur without either party abandoning fundamental positions or obligations. FBI agents working in Harlem during late 1950s and 1960s recognized Johnson as intelligent strategic actor, whose criminal activities they opposed but whose occasional cooperation on matters involving violent crimes, terrorism, or missing persons could serve legitimate law enforcement goals that justified temporary truces and information sharing. Johnson similarly recognized FBI as powerful adversary whose capabilities exceeded those of NYPD and whose jurisdiction over civil rights violations and interstate crimes created both threats and opportunities depending on how Johnson managed relationships with federal agents. The documentary evidence of Christopher's kidnapping and rescue remains fragmentary because FBI files on case were heavily redacted to protect informants and operational methods, including presumably any references to Johnson's role in discovery and recovery of victim, and because Johnson's organization maintained no records of its involvement in event that all participants understood, required careful management to avoid creating documentary evidence that might become problematic during future investigations. The accounts that survive come primarily from oral histories collected decades later from people who had direct knowledge of events, from Mamie Johnson's brief reference in her 2008 memoir to Time When Bumpy Saved White Child from KKK and helped FBI without asking anything in return except that they leave him alone for a while, and from limited references in Reynolds' family records that acknowledge gratitude to unnamed individuals who assisted in Christopher's recovery without specifying Johnson's identity or role. The legacy of Christopher's kidnapping and rescue influenced several important developments, including Reynolds's subsequent judicial decisions prioritizing civil rights enforcement, Christopher's own career as civil rights attorney working to address systemic racism, and gradual recognition within law enforcement that combating white supremacist terrorism sometimes required cooperation with unconventional sources, including criminal organizations whose intelligence networks provided access to information unavailable through legitimate investigative methods. These developments didn't eliminate moral complexities surrounding Johnson's role or resolve questions about whether celebrating criminals' humanitarian action legitimized broader harm his organization perpetrated, but they did demonstrate how specific incidents could shape individual lives and institutional practices in ways extending far beyond immediate crisis that triggered original intervention. The story of how Bumpy Johnson found White Child hidden in KKK leader's car trunk and discovered the child was federal judge's son, kidnapped to influence civil rights prosecution, represents intersection of multiple complex themes including white supremacist terrorism, federal law enforcement, criminal power, racial justice, child welfare, and moral choice in situations where right action wasn't clear or easy. The incident revealed institutional failures requiring criminals to provide protections that legitimate systems should have guaranteed, moral courage transcending racial boundaries and self-interest, and strategic intelligence recognizing opportunities to simultaneously serve humanitarian goals and organizational interests. Understanding this complexity requires avoiding both romanticization of criminals as heroes and simplistic condemnation that ignores genuine protective functions they sometimes performed when institutions failed. The lesson for contemporary audiences is that functioning democratic societies must provide equal protection and child safety through legitimate institutions rather than forcing communities or victims to depend on criminal organizations whose protection comes bundled with costs undermining the very communities and individuals they claim to defend. The challenge remains building institutions that actually deliver on promises of safety, justice, and human dignity rather than creating situations where criminals provide services that governments should guarantee. Christopher's story demonstrates both the potential for individual moral action, transcending systemic constraints, and the tragedy of systemic failures requiring such extraordinary interventions rather than providing routine institutional protections. The moral complexity of celebrating Johnson's rescue of Christopher while acknowledging his criminal exploitation of Harlem's community reflects broader American struggles with how to understand historical figures whose impacts resist simple categorization as hero or villain. Johnson's decision to save Christopher was admirable humanitarian action revealing genuine moral commitment, but it existed within context of criminal career causing substantial harm through gambling operations, violence against rivals, and general participation in illegal economy, extracting wealth from community while providing limited legitimate opportunities. Understanding Johnson requires holding these contradictions rather than resolving them into convenient narratives that either celebrate or condemn without nuance. The systemic changes necessary to eliminate situations requiring criminal intervention for child protection included adequate resources for law enforcement to prevent kidnappings and respond effectively when they occurred, sufficient intelligence gathering about terrorist organizations planning violence against children or other vulnerable populations, meaningful accountability for white supremacist terrorism rather than tolerance and neglect that allowed such violence to continue, and broader cultural transformation addressing racism that motivated terrorist organizations and shaped institutional responses prioritizing white victims while neglecting black victims of equivalent crimes. These changes occurred gradually through decades of activism, litigation, legislation, and institutional reform, though progress remained incomplete as persistent disparities demonstrated continuing failures to protect all children equally regardless of race or economic status. The story's place in larger history of American struggles with racism, terrorism, child welfare, and criminal justice deserves acknowledgement as example of how individual incidents revealed systemic patterns while also demonstrating human capacity for moral choice transcending structural constraints. Johnson's rescue of Christopher represented both victory for human decency over racism and indictment of institutions forcing reliance on criminals for protections that should have been guaranteed through legitimate channels. The incident illustrated how institutional failures created impossible moral situations where right choices involved cooperation between antagonists and where humanitarian actions by criminals revealed virtues exceeding those demonstrated by respectable citizens whose conventional morality coexisted with tolerance for systemic injustice.